In professional wrestling, there tends to be a stigma around rematches, but that's only because the one major promotion of the past 2 decades has done rematches to death. But I'm here to say that there's nothing wrong with rematches. As a matter of fact, rematches are a huge part of combat sports. I mean, just look at boxing and MMA, for example. It's pretty simple. People love a good series between opponents who mesh well, as long as you don't overdo it and as long as it's done right. And in the case of professional wrestling, as long as a story is being told, a story that, of course, engages the audience. If you're putting the same match week after week out there just to fill out TV time, then that's when you create a problem. But if characters are going through arcs throughout a series, then at least it gives us a reason to be watching. And don't get me wrong, a feud with multiple matches to its name that's actually telling a story doesn't automatically mean it's good either. For those who say I praise everything that AEW does, let me say right now that they have drawn out feuds that I was not a fan of. What needs to be done to avoid this issue is you need to strike a balance between interesting story and good matches. Which brings me to the topic of this video, the trilogy between Cody Rhodes and Sammy Guevara. The series between Cody and Sammy is one that started on the very first episode of AEW Dynamite on October 2nd, 2019. This was actually the first ever match in AEW Dynamite history, meaning it was the first wrestling match on TNT in almost 2 decades. The pressure could not have been any higher for Cody Rhodes and Sammy Guevara to deliver, and it was two very different types of pressure on each individual. Cody at the time was presenting himself as the main protagonist of AEW. This was his chance to silence all those doubters who thought he couldn't cut it in WWE, the doubters who thought he was coasting on his last name. This was a Cody Rhodes who had just come off a dominant run on the independent scene, Ring of Honor, and to a lesser extent, New Japan Pro Wrestling. Cody was here to prove that he could in fact lead a wrestling promotion. Then you had Sammy Guevara, who at the time was a much lesser known name compared to Cody Rhodes. But of course, that was only because Sammy was young. If you had seen Lucha Underground, AAA, or closely followed the independent scene, chances are you had already heard of him, but you'd had to be a hardcore wrestling fan. So the point Sammy was trying to prove here on the first ever match in Dynamite history was that he belonged in AEW, that he belonged on this big stage against one of the biggest stars in the company. And I wouldn't doubt that he was also trying to prove that WWE missed out by turning him down years ago. And in addition to all of this pressure, it didn't help that this match would be going directly head to head against Adam Cole versus Matt Riddle for the NXT World title on the USA Network. At the end of the day, both matches ended up being fantastic in their own right, and you can prefer one over the other. But what I'm here to argue is that Cody versus Sammy Guevara ended up being far more important than Adam Cole versus Matt Riddle, because AEW was playing the long game in comparison to NXT, who hotshotted this match in an attempt to beat AEW in the ratings. The first AEW match between Cody Rhodes and Sammy Guevara was a great one with a simple story. It was a fresh, new, exciting talent trying to hang with one of the biggest stars in the promotion. That's it. That's all it needed to be, and it worked. Sammy Guevara was immediately introduced to a worldwide audience and became an AEW regular since that day. The really cool thing is that this match didn't just have long-term payoff, it also had immediate payoff, because at the end of this show, Sammy Guevara would join Jericho-led group The Inner Circle, where for the next 7 months they would feud with AEW founding fathers The Elite, which Cody Rhodes is a part of. The first match between Sammy and Cody was a nice little bit of foreshadowing to the ending of the first episode of Dynamite. Now what's crazy is that for over 2 years, Sammy and Cody were largely kept separated. I mean, they never crossed paths after that in one-on-one competition. These two competitors, who are mainstays, anchors, pillars, founding fathers, whatever you want to call it, of AEW, didn't cross paths for a long time. They both went through their own individual arcs, both arcs that I covered in individual videos, which I'll link in the description below. So when Sammy Guevara became TNT champion, it made sense that Cody would want to face him, because he had already beaten him previously. Sure, it was a couple of years ago, but he still held a win over Sammy Guevara. Add to the fact that this was the TNT title, the belt that Cody had already held twice at that point. And so for this second encounter, both men were in different positions than they were in 2 years ago for their first match. Both men had developed, both men had changed, both men were far more complex now. Cody Rhodes has now lost all support from the people. He refuses to turn because he's choosing to do what he believes is the right thing. He's no longer the protagonist of AEW. He's the villain who thinks he's the hero. He's Homelander, or as I like to call him, Codelander. Then you have Sammy Guevara, who's no longer in his AEW rookie year. He's now an established name. He's now stepped in the ring with some of the biggest names that AEW has to offer, like Kenny Omega and Jon Moxley. Sammy Guevara is now a champion, holding the title that Cody Rhodes has held twice now, giving him every right in his mind to believe that he's now on the level of Cody Rhodes. He's now an equal to him. But perhaps the biggest difference here compared to their first encounter is that Sammy Guevara is now the one who's beloved by the AEW audience. He's the one who has the crowd behind him. Essentially, in their first match, Cody Rhodes had the home field advantage because he was still beloved by the AEW audience at that point. But for the second match, the roles were reversed. Sammy Guevara had home field advantage. He had everything going in his favor, which gave us the very simple story for this second match. Can Sammy Guevara, now as TNT champion, overcome the first obstacle he ever faced in AEW? The answer here was no. Due to Cody's experience and ruthlessness, he was able to overcome Sammy and beat him to become a 3-time TNT champion. Cody's new Homelander persona is what he needed to get back on track in AEW, and he did that by becoming TNT champion when he beat Sammy. But this left Sammy with 2 losses against Cody. Was he ever going to be able to overcome him? Here's where things get interesting. Sammy and Cody were going to have their rematch for the TNT title at Battle of the Belts, but due to COVID protocols, Cody Rhodes would be unable to compete at this show, so Dustin Rhodes, Cody's brother, would step in. Sammy and Dustin faced off in an attempt to be crowned the interim TNT champion. And after a fun match, it was of course Sammy Guevara who came out on top and became the interim TNT champion, which meant that we now had 2 TNT champions in AEW, which also meant that a unification match between Rhodes and Guevara was inevitable. This time, both men were truly equals, or at least they were on paper, because both men were holding the same championship. And of course, the unification match came in the form of a ladder match. An insane ladder match. And here for this third match of the trilogy, the story was presented in form of a question. Is Sammy Guevara ready to overcome Cody Rhodes? Coming into this match, Sammy had of course lost twice to Cody in AEW. It was going to take something special for him to beat Cody, a star-making performance. And that's exactly what Sammy Guevara gave us. As great as Sammy's first TNT title win was against Miro, I feel like this was his big breakthrough performance as a singles competitor. What Sammy did in this match will be played in highlight reels for the rest of AEW's lifetime. From the insane suplex he took from Cody off the ladder to of course the cutter, which was one of the most beautiful big spots I've ever seen in wrestling. I truly believe that this cutter is up there with Edge spearing Jeff Hardy off the ladder at WrestleMania 17. Also, of course, that Swanton Bomb that Sammy hit on Cody looked gnarly as hell because the ladder didn't break in the end, but that was still an insane spot. In the end, in this third match between 2 competitors with great chemistry, it was Sammy Guevara who finally overcame the one obstacle he couldn't overcome. I was rooting for Cody in this match, believe it or not. Of course, you all know that I'm the biggest Cody Rhodes fan on the planet. But in the end, I do believe this was the correct result. Sammy's first TNT title reign was starting to lose momentum. A lot of people weren't big fans, and by the way, that's more on the booking rather than Sammy. So him losing the title and having to overcome this guy that he has history with throughout his entire AEW run was a great way to get the title back on him because it gave him a big moment, especially with the star-making performance he had in this ladder match. And all the credit in the world to Cody Rhodes for putting over Sammy here. I don't know what show others are watching, but a lot of people like to say that Cody is like Triple H during the Reign of Terror, and that makes me believe that you either 1, never saw the Reign of Terror, or 2, you're just fucking ignorant. Cody Rhodes has now put over MJF, Darby Allin, and Sammy Guevara, 3 of the 4 pillars. This narrative that he buries people is so insane to me because I'm just asking myself, what show are you watching? Cody Rhodes is by far the biggest star in AEW who loses the most. You don't have to be a fan of his character work, that's fine, though I will say that you better jump on the bandwagon now because he's about to go on a tear in 2022, I just know it. But to say he doesn't put anyone over, that he just buries talent, is not only idiotic, it's completely false. And that brings me to my final point. The reason I'm happy with this result is because 1, it rejuvenated Sammy's run as TNT champion. He came out of that ladder match looking like a star. He looked like this generation's Jeff Hardy. It genuinely made me believe that this second run as TNT champion will be better than the first because the first wasn't Sammy's fault. If he can put on matches of this caliber, obviously without all the big bumps because he can't be doing that every week, then we'll be golden. And 2, because this means Cody Rhodes can now move on to something bigger. I'm sure we've all heard by now the recent developments of Cody Rhodes working in AEW without a contract. Whether it's true or not isn't the important part. The important part is that AEW has the opportunity to create one of the most intriguing storylines in their short history. I've been predicting it for months now. Cody Rhodes will one day go back on his word and challenge for the AEW World title. And with recent developments, the character change to Homelander, the promo he cut where he said he did everything CM Punk wanted to do in the pipe bomb, and now the expiring contract, I can't help but feel that we're now getting closer to the day where Cody Rhodes breaks his promise to the fans because the fans broke their relationship with him.